Dino Bones here, the INTP. I'd like to give my TI perspective on the relationship between cognitive functions and personality types. So on Reddit, I see on the MBTI Type Me subreddit, people posting, or even on the regular MBTI subreddit, people posting their cognitive function results from one of these cognitive function ranking tests and asking people to MBTI type them. And there's some disagreement usually about what type they are. And really this shouldn't happen. There should be a systematic way to go from your cognitive function ranking to your personality type. So that's what I want to talk about in this video. So for those of you who don't know, Carl Jung invented this concept of cognitive functions. He said that there are four basic functions: feeling, thinking, intuition, and sensing. And each one of those has an introverted and extroverted aspect to arrive at 8 total cognitive functions. And further, those cognitive functions are divided into what he called judging functions or decision-making functions, and perceiving functions or observing functions. So for those of you who are familiar with computer science, this would correspond to code versus data. And so these functions, the results from one of these cognitive function tests will give you a ranking of these 8 functions in order. But why do we need personality types? Why do we need MBTI? Well, the reason is that if we just look at this raw cognitive function ranking from 1 to 8, this gives us 40,320 personality types. And no matter how much you're into personality typing or personality type theory, this is just way too many types to keep track of or to care about. So we need some system to simplify things. So how do we arrive at this system? Well, using this kind of code and data pair idea, we can pair observing functions with deciding functions. So this is like CPU and RAM. And in Carl Jung's original conception, the internal decider and external observer were always paired, whereas the external decider was always paired with the internal observer. So he called this type of personality perceiving, and this type of personality with the external decider as judging. But I think the more modern conception of these personality types and cognitive functions is that any observer and any decider can be paired. And there's a popular system called objective personality that has names for these pairs called, they call perceiving consume, they call judging blast, and they call 2 extroverted functions paired as play, and 2 introverted functions paired as sleep. But I'm just going to stick to the MBTI letters and call this pair P, or perceiving, this pair judging, this pair E, or extroversion, this pair I, or introversion. So here I've marked the allowed personality types in MBTI as green and the forbidden ones in red, but I'm just going to go ahead and allow all 32 personality types, all 32 combinations. And what this means is that we need to come up with a naming system that allows us to name all 32 types using the original MBTI codes and concepts behind the letters. So this system works for the original 16 and also the extended 16 types that are double extroverted or double introverted. So the way it works is that you look at your first 2 functions and whether they're feeling or thinking, sensing or intuitive, this gives you the middle 2 letters. So you can either be an SF, an ST, an NF, or an NT, and this is called temperament. And then the last letter comes from whether your first pair is 2 extroverted functions, which makes you an extrovert, 2 introverted functions, which makes you an introvert, an extroverted decider with an introverted observer, which makes you a judger, J, extroverted perceiver with an introverted judger, which makes you a P. So it's a little unfortunate that the last letter corresponds to the first pair and the first letter corresponds to the first and third function pairing. So the way it works is that the first function is paired with the second and third function, and those are the two outer letters of your code. So if your lead function is green, you're an EJ. If your lead function is blue, one of these external observers, you're an EP. If your lead function is yellow, one of these internal observers, you're an IJ. And if your lead function is red, the internal decider, you're an IP. Okay, got it? So this is how the types work out, the 32 types. So if you're an IP or a PI, your lead function is one of the red internal deciders. If you're an EJ or JE, your lead function is one of the green external deciders. So these two together are the deciders. And then if you're an IJ or JI, your lead function is one of the internal observers, NI or SI. And then if you're an EP or a PE, your lead function is one of the external observers, SE or NE. Okay, so now that we have the codes and we have the system, let's try to type just this random cognitive function ranking. So the first thing we have to do is separate the 8 cognitive functions into the ego and shadow. This is another concept from Carl Jung, saying that 4 of your functions are conscious in the ego, and the other 4 functions are in the unconscious or the shadow. And once we've done that, we look at the first deciding and first observing function of the ego, and then we decide whether the person's lead function is the deciding function or observing function based on what the third function is. So the lead function has to be able to pair with both of the other functions. That determines whether you're an IJ, EJ, IP, or EP. And overall, this is going to give us 32 personality types. So notice that this cognitive function ranking, there are 42,320 of them, and we're condensing this, simplifying it down to 32 personality types. This means that there's a lot of hidden complexity here. There are 1,262 different rankings that fit into the same personality type. Okay, so here we separate it into the ego and the shadow. The way we do that is we look at the top observing function, which is SE, the top deciding or judging function, which is FE, and now we need one of each color and one of each letter. We already have an S and an F, so the other two have to be N and T. And we already have 2 extroverted functions, so the other 2 have to be introverted. So there's really no ambiguity here. This is the stack. And the leftover functions are in the shadow, and they also follow these rules, so they also correspond to one of the 32 personality types. So in this case, the stack is actually FE, SE, NI, TI. Why is that? Because the third function is a perceiving function, and that means the double activated function is the deciding function here, the FE. So the FE can pair with both the SE and the NI, and this is a JE. Has to be either an EJ or JE. If we look at the shadow, similarly the double activated function is actually the TE because it can pair with both the SI and the NE. So the shadow is an ESTJ. So normally in vanilla MBTI, your shadow is always what you get by flipping the first and fourth letter. So if you're JSFE, normally your shadow would be PSFI, which would be FI-SI, but actually this person has FI last, and so their shadow is actually ESTJ. Okay, let's do another example. So here we have this stack. We separate it into the ego and the shadow. So we find the first perceiving function and the first judging function here, an INTE. And then we need to have a feeling function that's the opposite introversion extroversion to the thinking function, and likewise for the sensing function it has to be the opposite color from the intuitive function. Okay, and so this gives us NINTE, and we can see the NI is the double activated function because it compares with the TE and the FI. So this is actually a normal MBTI INTJ, and normally the shadow of an INTJ would be ENTP. That's what you would expect. You just flip the first letter and the fourth letter. But this shadow is actually, the NE is double activated by the FE and TI. So the NE is the lead function of the shadow. So this is an EP like it should be. However, it's not an ENTP. It's because the FE is much stronger than the TI. So if this were an ENTP, it would be NETI, but this is actually an NEFE double extrovert, NF. Okay, and finally we have this function stack. So we split it to the ego and the shadow. So our ego has FI, SE, TE, and NI. However, here the SE is the double activated function. It compares with the FI and the TE, the two judging functions or deciding functions. And so this is actually an ESFP. With the lead SE, it has to be an EP. And so normally the shadow in normal MBTI theory, or like C.S. Joseph, shadow is going to be an ISFJ. But here, this shadow stack, the FE is actually double activated by the SI and the NE. So this shadow stack is more of an ESFJ. Yeah, this one is pretty borderline because the FE is so low. So this person might appear as more of an ISFJ. Okay, so that's it. That's how you can repeatedly go from a cognitive function stack to one of these 32 MBTI types with no ambiguity. So happy typing, everybody.